In Kansas City, it's an early morning. It might begin with a fresh Charlie Hustle t-shirt, a brisk walk near the Power and Light District, a conversation about how the Chiefs should have played the last drive differently. There's Q39 smoke trails in the air. By late morning, someone's wearing the Jayhawk blue, even though it's the off season. These cycles feel informal, maybe even comfortable. The feelings of LA, though, are often performative because underneath these nonchalant ceremonies endures an area negotiating a real tension. I'm not talking about sports or civic pride, though, folks. I'm talking about infrastructure, which may not sound glamorous, but it's the one thing you definitely notice when it breaks. Today, we're talking about the I-70 corridor, and deeper still, we're talking about the Ogallala Aquifer, both forming a nervous system of Kansas, both cracking underneath the weight of political vacillation and ecological urgency. Ignoring a depleting aquifer is kind of like hitting the snooze button on your fire alarm. It's fraudulently placid, and more it's hazardous. This isn't stoicism, it is procrastination in a lab coat, and eventually the lab catches fire. So let's ask what happens when material reality of infrastructure begins to collapse due to ideological posturing. What happens when your metaphors are no longer values, but appear as misguided paper clips holding a road together? The driving on I-70 altogether ignores it's so far it's ignored the farmers and it's affected people's water bills. And this is and aquifers affected people's water bills. This is a decision at the fulcrum. So today we're exploring how Kansas is not just confronting a crisis, but it's also adapting its ideological building blocks, one resurfaced road and one groundwater compromise at a time. Let's begin with when asphalt forces a conversation. Let's first talk about I-70, which may not look like an arena, but it is. I've taken this drive many times. Interstate 70 runs through the Missouri line, it runs through Kansas City and Topeka. It finally gets into Colorado, and you're going to uh, get into Burlington and Lyman and Denver, and then you're going to get to Grand Junction. You'll get to Utah, and from there you need to make a decision if you're going to go south toward Vegas or you're going to go north toward Provo on the I-15. It's not just a road, it's a main expressway of the state's commerce in Kansas. And you've got trucks carrying wheat, semiconductors, and pallets of pet food and grains. Perhaps you're also moving individuals on their road trips across the U.S. in their RVs, and they're heading toward Wyoming or Montana through I-90 eventually, or you're going down through I-25 in New Mexico. I-70 is important because, first of all, it's one of the highways under the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. I-70 was one of the first freeways constructed, named after originally thanks to Kansas native Dwight D. Eisenhower. It became the centerpiece of the interstate highway system. So, the late 1950s saw the start of this construction, and the first part of I-70 started in Topeka in 1956. What I'm hinting at here is that I-70 has been around for several decades. To fully comprehend how Kansas is meeting the moment, let's stay on I-70. So let's drive it. Okay, from west to east, let's start at the state line between Colorado and Kansas. And when I cross from Colorado into Kansas, it feels like I'm driving through a glitch in a simulation. Colorado is still being rendered in high resolution, and Kansas seems to have forgotten how to load the texture pack here. One moment I'm on a functional road, and the next I'm navigating a post-apocalyptic asphalt confetti. It's like time travel, specifically to a place where civil maintenance and infrastructure gave up. The Ike program, though, which was implemented in 2020, isn't only a symbolic program. It is a literal maintenance of and the promise and a fulfillment of a Cold War promise. It's a $10 billion commitment to, with bipartisan support. It's a corridor focused design and a focus on not just building new infrastructure, although that's part of it. It's also about resurrecting what we once took for granted. So let's take this drive. Welcome to Western Kansas. We are driving through the long stretches. It's going to be flat. It's going to be wind worn. Stretch of pavement. It's been rough here. If you're going through this pavement, you're going to step in. You're going to see a lot of pavement rehabilitation. You're going to see a lot of shoulder widening and resurfacing to support the freight economy, thanks to Ike. And if we're going through Colby and Goodland and Hayes, this is where the grain is moving and the shoulders are unfortunately crumbling. But Ike is going to invest in bridge repair and embankment stabilization and in passing lane additions, not just to preserve the safety, although that's part of it, but also to keep the agricultural exports moving. Then if you get to around exit 157 near Hayes and you get on the US 183, this is where you're going to reach a bottleneck. But through funding of Ike, they are going to have a full interchange redesigned to alleviate the harvest season backups and enhance access to Fort Hayes, because access in that area, it's back on I-70. Let's get back on I-70 and go to Salina and Junction City, where you are at a crossroad of the east-west line in Kansas and the north-south freight corridors. So the Ike program is going to update on ramp expansion here and interchange monetization, and then finally we're going to get to Topeka, where the iconic Polk Quincy Viaduct has been aging because it was built in the mid-century. Under the Ike program, though, it's going to replace that with a modern viaduct that's specific, that type of bridge that essentially consists of like arches. Yeah, and it's going to replace that with something that meets those 21st century traffic standards. There's more people there, though, than there were driving in the 1950s, though. So finally, we've made it to Topeka. We're going to get to Lawrence and Kansas City Metro, and Ike here is tackling everything from ramp redesign to the K-10 and get closer to the University of Kansas to the viaduct overhauls on the Lewis and Clark. And these fixes are more than cosmetic, they are strategic. The entire Kansas City corridor, once we get there, is serving as an economic population anchor of the state. What I'm saying here is that the Ike program for I-70 isn't just a road repair plan. It's a symbolic recommitment to mobility and to economic viability. And it proves something important. When potholes grow too deep and bridges start to crumble, even traditional ideological dogma of lawmakers they'll find themselves resurfacing the road for this reason, okay? Because it's necessary. Ideology may steer policy. Asphalt sets the limits of this. So the 2020 start of the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program, the actual upholding of commitment that was made during the Cold War. It's fulfillment of that promise. It connects the economics of the state with the changing identity of Kansas, and it follows along that line of I-70, of that social and historical legacy of Kansas in response to the present moment demands, as well as plans for the future of the state. This doesn't care as much about ideologies, because eventually roads crack and bridges buckle, and voters start to ask why their commute feels like a demolition derby. In 2020, this Ike was launched, and it's an adaptive ideology in action. Or as Tracy might frame it, this is a moment of situated resilience. It's where the actors within an organization, in this case, the state legislature, and other stakeholders as well. It's a patchwork of state legislators, the planners, the freight logistics leaders, engage in what Tracy calls emotionally resonant sense making. My spouse was working in the Kansas City Chamber several years ago when this started, and saw these partnerships in action. And people in this case aren't just choosing policy, they're not just choosing ideological dogma, they're reinterpreting what it means to be Kansans who care deeply about the future of the state in the face of physical deterioration. It's not just about physical discipline or self-reliance, it's about the survival of the infrastructure and the place that you live. Let's begin now looking at the Ogallala Aquifer, because if I-70 is a visible crisis, the Ogallala Aquifer is the invisible urgency of another crisis that's happening in Kansas. Okay, the Ogallala Aquifer, it's a vast underground reservoir, stretches from South Dakota all the way to Texas, runs right through Kansas, primarily through western Kansas. The dilemma here is that drawing water at rates, we've been drawing water at rates that far exceed what nature can actually replenish. And so the Ogallala Aquifer stretches around 174,000 square miles. Talk about a thirst quencher on a grand scale. It is the backbone of the High Plains Water District, though. It is the High Plains Water District service area and holds the title of being the most popular, so to speak, aquifer in this neck of the woods. About 95% of the water drawn from the Ogallala Aquifer is dedicated to the glamorous world of irrigated agriculture and livestock production. But 7 million years ago, it was just forming. Okay, what does Kansas look like 7 million years ago? Well, when this was forming, let's see. Can I get in my time machine and set it to 7 million years ago? Oh, it looks like I need some advanced settings for that. So I'm going to try to update this for the next future episodes to try to go back 7 million years. But until then, I don't want to risk getting lost in the late Miocene. So let's just imagine Kansas 7 million years ago. Kansas streams are spilling granule ingredients like sand and gravel and silt. Inch by inch over the eons, this messy layering is forming what will become the aquifer. And that ground is like a sponge, okay? Let's imagine like you have a chef named Rocky Mountains, and Chef Rocky Mountains is chopping and grating and grinding this rock. Let's just say that the rock is like an ancient loaf of bread, and it's being chopped into sediment. It's breaking off onto the ground. And this is the gravel and the sand and the silt and the clay as the prepping ingredients. And every time it rains, the crumbs from that rock, from that bread, if you will, in the comes down in the form of sand, gravel, and silt that falls off and gets swept to the edge of a table, and those land on a sponge that eventually today knows Kansas. So the U.S. Geological Survey and the Kansas Geological Survey date that Ogallala Aquifer between 10 and 2 million years ago. So it developed over around 8 million years. And those ingredients that I just went over, they're tossed down that vast the high plains are receiving them in slow motion, very slow motion, an avalanche of water and debris, and every rainstorm and every snow melt and every ancient flood carried a little more geological trail mix down the mountains and spread it across the plains. Instead of baking it though, or boiling it, nature just kind of layered it like a long, slow lasagna that's been in that instant pot. And it has been an alternating bed in coarse gravel and fine sand and sticky clay. And that those layers get packed down into the kind of sediment. The magic happens when the sponge starts to hold water, though. So rainfall and snow melt are seeped into those top layers, and there you have your Ogallala Aquifer, a massive underground casserole of ancient runoff, slow to fill, fast to drain if it's overused. So Kansas sits on top of one of the largest underground water supplies, at least one of the largest in the United States, and it's already been down though. It's already down 60 to 70%. That depletion has been known for decades. It has been decades in the making, but the response has been about as slow as it took to build it. It seems like driven by agriculture's political weight and the cultural distance from against regulation, and instead of falling back on what's seen as personal use of land. So that is probably a very familiar ideology if you're listening to this in the United States. But that began to change recently. So what we're witnessing here is a decision at the fulcrum, close to what is happening uh, presently in Kansas, what you can actually see. Water policy is very important now. It's what Tracy would call the cultural co-construction of meaning is occurring here. The quiet emergence of new meanings around a resource use and stewardship and what it means to belong in a place that will no longer provide what it once did. So farmers in local enhanced management areas are not simply just following the decisions of Topeka on the other side of Kansas. They're also reauthoring, they're part of this conversation. They're reauthoring the situated meaning in the present day, not in ideology, not in a past or not in nostalgia, but they are moving from being told that they are just producers of agricultural goods to being stewards of the richness of the land, from short term yields as nationalist maximizers to long term local models of the future in the present.
I am so grateful to those of you in the legislature and beyond who have been working with me to change decades of inaction on our water supply. The Kansas Water Authority has gone all over the state, listening to farmers, crop insurers, feedlot owners, and bankers, over 1,500 stakeholders. As a result, we have set a goal. From now on, each generation will work to protect our water supply for the next 2 generations. We're calling it the multi-generational promise. It may look different in different areas of the state, but the fundamentals are the same. Stabilize the Ogallala Aquifer, maximize the capacity of our reservoirs, and ensure all Kansans have access to clean, sustainable water.
So what Laura Kelly said in her State of the State address in Kansas on January 15th of 2025 is that she said from now on each generation will work to protect our water supply for the next 2 generations that follow. In 2023 something broke open, basically a fresh wave of bipartisan legislative efforts have come up from the ground, right? They have resurfaced, to use this. They've all revolved though around a common idea that voluntary measures weren't cutting it. So the legislature went ahead and passed Bill 2279, and that bill requires the Groundwater Management District, or GMDs, which are those local agencies that keep an eye or two on the water use, to form a conservation and management plan. So they can't just be grand plans for the goals of future decades. For the first time ever in the state's history, the GMDs had to deal with real accountability. In other words, when it came to keeping the aquifer sustainable, because back in the 70s, the GMDs first came about thanks to the Groundwater Management District Act, Self-regulation was the norm. It sounds really great in theory, but if you don't provide some structure for it, it doesn't work out in practice. Aquifer kept going down, and especially in southwest Kansas. And this isn't the fault of anyone. This isn't the fault of any individual group or any person. The lack of accountability, though, can lead to a bit of confusion as to what is really being promoted and expected. And so in 2023, finally, after all that time, things became a little bit too obvious in terms of the aquifer, and the state began to change a few rules and in some important ways. The GMDs, if they didn't get their credible conservation plans together on time under this new law, they might end up under some district oversight, and they might not want that. So this is a real change from the structure. It's not just talk. In other words, it changes Kansas from a place of passivity to a type of conditional motivation to get this right so that future generations, and so the current generation too, can have the same opportunities to farm the land as previous generations. They still honor, though, the legislators still honoring the local leadership. They're just finally ready to say you need to be able to manage a disappearing aquifer with more than idealism and a handshake. And if we look at it, if we look at the legislation, you can see that in the summer of 2023, the Kansas lawmakers, that legislation that directed 35 million annually from the general fund to the Kansas water plan, and that's up previously from 8 million, that's dedicated specifically to the aquifer conservation. That's according to the Hayes Post for water project grants and for technical assistance and for grants and contributions toward the reservoir debt relief. That would also help. All these things are going to help. It also requires groundwater management districts to identify priority conservation areas and create water saving strategies. And these 2023 plans were passed in both chambers, signed by Governor Laura Kelly, and requires now that 5 GMDs submit that groundwater conservation plan by July 1st of 2026, a year from the time I'm recording this. The 2023 Kansas Water Authority explicitly declared land depletion of the Ogallala is no longer acceptable. In other words, what else did the bill do? It directed the Western Kansas districts. Groundwater legislation like this begins to channel the tax revenues into state water land plans, projecting to bring about 54 million in the first fiscal year in from those revenues. That was according to the Nebraska Examiner. In March of 2024, around 230 participants from 8 state regions convened under the theme of building trust and mobilizing collaboration. That fostered a shared strategy among farmers, water managers, researchers, and policy experts. And it's a serious crisis here that requires serious planning. So the Kansas Geological Survey, which is part of the University of Kansas, presented to this group, the group about the water being pumped in western Kansas. People really have no idea how much water comes out of the ground, but Kansas is really unique in the aspect that they actually do know how much water is coming out of the ground from this aquifer because they have a lot of water data because farming is so central to the Kansas story. And this water is not going to flow down to Wichita. It's not going to pump over to Oklahoma, down to Oklahoma, and the water that's conserved is going to be there to stay, hopefully. So by 2023, the status of that aquifer confirmed that critical depletion. It emphasized the conservation planning through stakeholder collaboration. That's what Kelly is talking about in her State of the State when she talks about over 1,500 stakeholders being involved in the solution. The decision to do something different, the decision to do something that is hard but is necessary, and the decades from now, people will be able to live in this region of Kansas because of it. In this episode of Decisions at the Fulcrum, we've looked at how aging infrastructure and environmental pressures in Kansas have been tested and have been forced to reconsider long-held political ideologies. In terms of this, in terms of the necessitation, because of the necessitation of an old ancient idea known as collaboration and another idea known as cooperation among a variety of stakeholders. The episode today focused on 2 areas of this. We looked at I-70 and we looked at groundwater usage in the Ogallala Aquifer. We explored how decision making is more than simply solving problems. It's also about redefining the community, awareness, and responsibility. In the first case, we looked at the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program, the IKE. It's more, though, than just a road rehabilitation effort. It's a significant public expenditure that signifies and points to a change in the approach from Kansas to infrastructure and economic viability. Despite being reluctant to add additional taxes for decades, they are now willing to invest in their future. How real world conditions like failing roadways and the rising needs of freight can overcome ideological involved multiple stakeholders to do so. They involved The city and the county authorities across the I-70 corridor, they involve freight firms and logistical providers in the Kansas Department of Transportation and local citizens and the commuters and military sites, including those at Fort Riley, which is essential because freight and military usage contributes to the identification of priority locations. And the towns along the route provide insight into economic significance. Lawmakers can collaborate across party lines in this particular situation to secure funding and planners that can work to guarantee both practicality and safety. So at the end outcome of this can be more than better roads. It can be better roads, but it can also be a recommitment to a promise of a common infrastructure that has a shared benefit for people that live in the state. In case study two, we looked at the Ogallala Aquifer for decades. The aquifer is one of the largest groundwater sources in the world that has been overused for decades, and it has also sustained the agricultural economy of Kansas. But the sluggish recharge rate made the depletion a long-term issue and also now an immediate issue. Kansas approved Bill 2279 in 2023, which requires groundwater management districts to turn in their real date conservation plans or risk. This is a significant shift from the policies of the past. This is a real decision at the fulcrum moment, which is mostly farmers that use irrigation for their crops to the GMDs that control the local water use. The stakeholders include the legislature, of course, the Department of Agriculture in Kansas, the people that are the expert scientists like at the University of Kansas and K-State, and the hydrologists and research institutes like the Kansas Geological Survey. Community leaders as well, and rural inhabitants, of course, are central to these conversations. Multiple stakeholders are central because you have people that are contributing to their real world experience, like farmers contributing their real world experience. GMDs, you have the historical authority, but although it's in the past it's had a disjointed level of success in their enforcement, and you have scientists that are experts in technical aspects and the data of this degradation that's happening, and then lawmakers and civic leaders who are working to strike that balance between sovereignty of municipalities and the responsibility and the reality of the particular context of the moment. That 2023 law established responsibility while also acknowledging the local wisdom, in other words. Very impressive, in my view. More than a legal reform, it represented a pivot in the attitudes of Kansas about water. Tracy, a communication expert, has proposed this frenetic iterative inquiry, and this can explain stuff that I've talked about in the shift. And an actual solution can emerge when the thinking is morally grounded as well as practical, is what Tracy might say. When stakeholder input is comprehensive and when the action is deliberate and interactive. So complex decisions require widespread collaboration. The Ike for I-70, HB 2279 for the Ogallala Aquifer show that successful crisis responses require more than just technological improvements, more than just political power, more than just ideological dogma. Certainly, the judgments are successful when people co-create that narrative, co-create the structure together. Stakeholders help define the issue. A lot of views are included. In other words, it's not just a singular voice. Expertise is taken from numerous sources: scientific, practical, experiential. And the judgment is based on real world complexity. It's based on not just hired economic ideologies, hired idealistic notions from the middle of the 20th century. The judgment is based on real world need for accountability rather than pursuing perfection or resigning to the reality of depletion. To strive for accountability and flexibility. And those reactions from people are appreciated and welcome. Tracy highlights that emotions reflect how individuals process and change and ascribe meanings to new situations, and a crisis is one of these situations where it's not just a test of systems, it's a moment of meaning, meaningful co creation from roadways to aquifers. The state of Kansas discovering that this type of movement along the highway, movement forward, requires shared narratives, and a willingness to change in some cases. This has been Decisions at the Fulcrum. Dr. William Hoffman. I'll see you along the way, perhaps on I-70.